The splash echoed across the Malibu mansion's pool deck like a gunshot, silencing 50 charity gala guests mid-conversation. Victoria Chen Morrison watched in horror as her grandmother's jade ring disappeared beneath the chlorinated surface. The same ring that had survived the Cultural Revolution, hidden in a jar of rice for 3 years. "Did you just throw my grandmother's ring in the pool?" Victoria's voice barely rose above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet, everyone heard her. Richard Morrison straightened his designer tie and smiled that cold smile she'd learned to fear over their 22-year marriage. "Maybe now you'll understand I'm serious about this ridiculous pregnancy nonsense." The words hit Victoria like ice water. At 8 months pregnant, wearing a flowing blue dress that barely concealed her swollen belly, she felt exposed under the stares of Los Angeles elite. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her mother's distress. "That ring survived war. Richard, it was all my grandmother had left when she fled China." Victoria's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing inside her. Richard's laugh carried no warmth. "Well, it's gone now, just like this marriage will be if you don't get rid of that thing." He gestured dismissively toward her pregnant form. A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson from the country club dropped her champagne flute. The sound of shattering crystal punctuated the moment like an exclamation point. "Sir, that's completely inappropriate," said Dr. Patricia Nguyen, Victoria's obstetrician, who had attended the charity event as a guest. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death situations. Richard turned his millionaire ex-husband attitude toward the doctor. "This is a private family matter. Perhaps you should mind your own business." From the corner of her eye, Victoria noticed the pool maintenance worker watching the confrontation unfold. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 30s, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything. Something about his posture suggested he was more than just hired help. "Ma'am," the pool worker said quietly, stepping forward. "I can help you get that ring back." Richard spun around, his face flushing red. "Excuse me, no one asked for your opinion, pool boy." "Actually," the man replied calmly, "I think everyone here would agree that throwing a pregnant woman's family heirloom in a pool crosses several lines. I'm Marco Rodriguez, and I'd be happy to retrieve your ring, Mrs. Morrison." Victoria felt tears threatening to spill. In 22 years of marriage, no stranger had ever stood up for her against Richard's public humiliation tactics. "Thank you, but I don't want to cause more trouble." "The only trouble here," Marco said, his voice carrying surprising authority, "is a grown man terrorizing his pregnant wife at a charity event." Richard's business partner, David Chen, appeared at his elbow. "Richard, perhaps we should take this conversation somewhere more private. People are starting to record this on their phones." For the first time, Richard seemed to realize the social disaster he'd created. His political aspirations and business reputation depended on maintaining his image as a philanthropic family man. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that his narcissistic abuse had finally happened in front of witnesses who mattered to him. "This conversation isn't over," Richard hissed at Victoria before stalking toward the mansion. As the crowd slowly resumed their conversations, Victoria remained frozen by the pool's edge. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from across the decades. "Strength comes not from avoiding storms, but from learning to dance in the rain." Marco began rolling up his sleeves. "The good news is, I'm an excellent diver. The challenging news is that your husband just revealed more about his character than he probably intended." Dr. Nguyen approached quietly. "Victoria, your blood pressure must be through the roof right now. This kind of stress isn't good for you or the baby." "I know," Victoria whispered, "but I don't know how to make it stop." Marco paused in his preparations. "Mrs. Morrison, I think after I retrieve your ring, we might need to have a different kind of conversation. One about protecting you and your baby from this kind of treatment." Something in his tone made Victoria look at him more carefully. This wasn't just kindness from a pool maintenance worker. This was something else entirely. As Marco dove cleanly into the pool, Victoria felt her baby kick again, softer this time, almost like approval. For the first time in months, she wondered if the feeling in her chest might actually be hope. The ring glinted in Marco's hand as he surfaced, water streaming from his hair. One family heirloom, safe and sound. Victoria accepted the ring with shaking hands, sliding it back onto her finger where it belonged. The jade felt warm, as if it held all her grandmother's strength and love. "Thank you," she said simply. "Mrs. Morrison," Marco said quietly as he climbed out of the pool. "I think we should talk, but not here, and not now. When you're ready." He handed her a business card, and Victoria's world tilted. The card read, "Marco Rodriguez, attorney at law, specializing in family law and divorce proceedings." Her millionaire ex-husband had just humiliated her in front of a divorce lawyer who moonlighted as a pool maintenance worker. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all. As the guests gradually departed and the staff cleaned up the remnants of the charity gala, Victoria stood alone by the pool, turning the business card over in her hands. 22 years of marriage, and she was finally seeing clearly. Her grandmother's ring caught the last rays of sunlight, sending small rainbows dancing across the water's surface. Some treasures, Victoria realized, were worth fighting for. The baby kicked once more, and Victoria smiled for the first time in months. 3 hours later, as the last guests drove away in their luxury cars, Victoria found herself alone on the pool deck. The catering staff had cleared away the evidence of the afternoon's humiliation, leaving only the gentle sound of the pool filter humming in the evening air. She hadn't been able to bring herself to go inside the mansion. Every room held reminders of the life she'd built with Richard, the life that was crumbling around her like a house of cards. Instead, she sat in a poolside chair, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching Marco's business card. "Mrs. Morrison." Marco's voice came from behind her. He'd changed from his pool maintenance uniform into khakis and a polo shirt, looking more like the professional attorney his business card claimed him to be. "You came back," Victoria said without turning around. "I told you we needed to talk." Marco pulled up a chair beside her. "First, though, how are you feeling? That was a lot of stress for someone in your condition." Victoria finally looked at him. In the golden hour light, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. "You're really a divorce attorney." "I am. Harvard Law, 15 years of practice, specializing in high-asset divorce cases involving domestic abuse." Marco's voice was gentle but professional. "I work weekends as a diving instructor because I need the stress relief. The law can be emotionally draining. So this is just coincidence. You happening to be here when my husband publicly humiliated me." Marco shook his head. "Mrs. Morrison, I've been watching your husband's behavior all afternoon. The way he speaks to you, the way he dismisses your feelings, the control tactics. I was actually planning to approach you before the ring incident happened." Victoria felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "You were watching us. I was observing patterns of narcissistic abuse. Your husband's behavior fits a textbook profile. The public humiliation, the threats about the pregnancy, the way he isolates you from conversations." Marco's voice was calm but serious. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to tell you something important. While you were inside changing clothes, I overheard your husband on a phone call." "What kind of phone call?" "He was talking to someone about contesting paternity of your baby. He mentioned having evidence of an alleged affair, and he was discussing moving assets offshore to protect them from divorce proceedings." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, feeling dizzy. "But I've never had an affair. We've been trying to get pregnant for 3 years. I believe you. But Mrs. Morrison, your husband isn't planning to let you have this baby in peace. He's already building a case to destroy you financially and take away your credibility as a mother." Victoria's mind raced. She thought about the last few months, Richard's increasing hostility about the pregnancy, his comments about her age, his suggestions that maybe they should reconsider their options. She'd attributed it to stress about becoming a father at 52. Now she saw it differently. How do you know when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving? The question escaped before she could stop it. "I keep thinking about all those years, wondering if I was blind or just hoping things would change." Marco was quiet for a moment. "That's the question every person in your situation asks themselves. The answer is different for everyone, but there are warning signs: escalating control, financial manipulation, threats related to children." "Mrs. Morrison, throwing your ring in the pool wasn't really about the ring. It was about power. Exactly. Is he wanted to show you and everyone else that he can take away anything that matters to you, your family heirlooms, your financial security, your baby. Marco leaned forward slightly. But here's what he doesn't know. California is a community property state. His business assets, the properties, the investments he thinks he's hiding, you're entitled to half of everything acquired during your marriage. Victoria looked down at her grandmother's ring, still wet from the pool. He said the marriage would be over if I don't get rid of the baby. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand something. Whether you stay or leave, whether you fight or try to keep the peace, your husband is already planning to leave you with nothing. The only question is whether you're going to protect yourself and your daughter. Daughter? Victoria's hand moved to her belly. How did you know? Marco smiled slightly. Lucky guess. You keep referring to the baby with protective language that sounds maternal. Plus, your husband's phone conversation mentioned something about not wanting to pay 18 years of support for a girl who'll just get married anyway. The casual cruelty of Richard's words, filtered through Marco's professional delivery, made Victoria feel sick. He really said that? I'm afraid so. Mrs. Morrison, I specialize in cases like this because I've seen what happens when women wait too long to protect themselves. The earlier you act, the more options you have. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, watching the pool lights create patterns on the water. The baby was active tonight, responding to her elevated stress levels with constant movement. If I hired you, she said finally, what would happen next? First, we document everything. Your husband's threats, the financial manipulation, any evidence of his plan to contest paternity. We'd also file for temporary spousal support and make sure you have access to marital funds for living expenses. He controls all the accounts. Not legally. You have rights to marital assets even during divorce proceedings. Mrs. Morrison, your husband may be wealthy, but wealth doesn't override the law. As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's voice carried across the pool deck from the mansion's open French doors. He was on another phone call, his tone sharp and commanding. She's more manageable when she's scared, they heard him say. The pregnancy hormone thing makes her emotional anyway. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. Victoria and Marco exchanged glances. The casual way Richard discussed manipulating her confirmed everything Marco had been trying to tell her. Mrs. Morrison, Marco said quietly, he's not going to stop. This behavior will only escalate, especially once the baby arrives and you're more vulnerable. Victoria thought about her grandmother, who had survived war and displacement, who had protected her family through impossible circumstances. The ring on her finger seemed to pulse with warmth. If I fight back, Victoria said, what are my chances of winning based on what I've observed and overheard today? Very good. Your husband is arrogant, which makes him careless. He's already made several strategic mistakes, like throwing my ring in the pool in front of 50 witnesses. Exactly, Mrs. Morrison. You have more power in this situation than you realize. The question is whether you're ready to use it. Victoria stood up slowly, one hand supporting her lower back. The baby kicked again, and she found herself thinking about what kind of world she wanted to bring her daughter into. Mr. Rodriguez, she said formally, I'd like to schedule a consultation, a real one, in your office, where we can discuss my options properly. Marco stood as well, extending his hand. Mrs. Morrison, it would be my honor to represent you. As they shook hands, Victoria felt something shift inside her. Not just the baby moving, but something deeper. For the first time in 22 years, she was making a decision based on her own needs instead of Richard's demands. The pool lights illuminated the water where her grandmother's ring had been rescued, and Victoria thought about treasures worth fighting for. Some things, she was beginning to understand, were too precious to let go without a battle. The following Monday morning found Victoria in her art studio, a converted bedroom on the mansion's second floor that Richard tolerated because it kept her busy and out of his business affairs. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating canvases that told the story of her emotional journey over the past several years. Victoria mixed blues and grays on her palette, adding touches of gold that somehow always found their way into her work lately. The baby was quieter today, as if sensing her mother's need for calm contemplation. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Sarah Kim. Coffee today. You sounded weird when you called yesterday. Instead of responding immediately, Victoria studied the painting on her easel. It showed a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, but she'd painted multiple paths leading away from the precipice. Escape routes, she realized now. She'd been painting escape routes for years without conscious awareness. The phone rang, and Sarah's voice filled the studio with familiar warmth. Vicky, you've been painting your way out of that marriage for 5 years. Maybe it's time to take one of those paths. You think I'm being dramatic, Victoria said, continuing to paint as she spoke. I think you're being too careful. Tell me again what happened at the charity gala. Victoria recounted the pool incident, Richard's cruelty, and the unexpected appearance of Marco Rodriguez. As she spoke, she realized how the story sounded to an outside observer. Wait, Sarah interrupted. A divorce attorney was working as a pool guy at your charity event. That's either the luckiest coincidence in history or the universe telling you something. That's what I keep thinking. Victoria paused, brushed halfway to canvas. Sarah, he overheard Richard planning to contest the baby's paternity, to claim I had an affair. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Vicky, you need to get out of there. Today, I can't just leave. I have no money of my own. Nowhere to go. Richard has made sure of that. That's exactly why you need a lawyer. What did this Marco guy say about your options? Victoria was about to answer when she heard a soft clicking sound from the corner of the studio. She turned toward the noise, paintbrush still in hand, and noticed something that made her blood run cold. Sarah, I have to call you back. Why? What's wrong? I think there's a camera in my studio. Victoria ended the call and moved toward the small black device mounted behind a plant on her bookshelf. It was barely visible, but once she'd spotted it, she realized it had been there for months, maybe longer. Her hands shook as she examined the tiny camera without touching it. How many hours of her private moments had Richard been watching? How many phone calls had he overheard? How many times had she stood in this room, thinking she was alone, while he surveilled her most intimate thoughts and creative expressions? The baby kicked hard, responding to Victoria's spiking stress levels. She sat down heavily in her painting chair, trying to process this new violation of her privacy and autonomy. Richard's voice echoed from downstairs, talking to someone about quarterly projections and market expansion. The casual normalcy of his tone, knowing what she'd just discovered, made her feel nauseated. Victoria looked around the studio with new eyes, searching for other hidden devices. If Richard had been recording her, what else had he been monitoring? Her emails, her text messages, her medical appointments. The implications crashed over her like waves. Every conversation with Sarah, every private moment, every tear she'd shed in this space thinking she was safe. Richard had turned her sanctuary into a surveillance chamber. She thought about Marco's warning that narcissistic abuse often escalated. Throwing her ring in the pool had been a public humiliation. But this was something far more sinister. This was systematic control designed to eliminate any possibility of privacy or independence. With trembling fingers, Victoria retrieved Marco's business card from her purse and dialed his number. Rodriguez Law Offices, this is Janet. This is Victoria Morrison. I need to speak with Mr. Rodriguez immediately. Mrs. Morrison, he's in court this morning, but he left instructions that you should be put through to his cell phone if you called. Please hold. The wait felt eternal. Victoria could hear Richard's voice getting closer, his footsteps on the marble stairs. She'd have to pretend everything was normal while her world was disintegrating around her. Mrs. Morrison. Marco's voice was calm and reassuring. What's happening? I found cameras in my art studio. He's been watching me, recording me. The words came out in a rush. Are you somewhere private right now? Yes, but he's coming upstairs. I can hear him. Listen carefully. Don't touch the cameras. Don't let him know you've discovered them. We'll need them as evidence. Can you get out of the house for a few hours? I have a prenatal appointment this afternoon. Perfect. Come to my office afterward. We need to accelerate our timeline. Richard's voice was just outside the studio door now. Victoria, who are you talking to? I have to go, Victoria whispered into the phone. Mrs. Morrison, Marco said quickly. You're not alone in this anymore. Victoria ended the call just as Richard appeared in the doorway. She forced herself to smile, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to confront him about the cameras. Just checking on my appointment with Dr. Nguyen, she said, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Good. We need to discuss some things about the baby arrangements. Richard's tone was casual, but Victoria now heard the underlying threat. I've been doing some research about parenting at our age. Oh, Victoria turned back to her painting, hoping her face didn't betray her racing thoughts. There are a lot of complications that can arise. Genetic issues, developmental problems. It might be wise to do some additional testing. Victoria's paintbrush stilled on the canvas. She understood exactly what he was suggesting, and it had nothing to do with their baby's health. Dr. Nguyen says everything looks perfect, Victoria replied carefully. Doctors can be wrong. I've been consulting with specialists about high-risk pregnancies. They recommend amniocentesis, genetic counseling, that sort of thing. The baby kicked, and Victoria put her hand over the movement protectively. Richard watched the gesture with cold calculation. I trust my doctor, Victoria said firmly. Trust is a luxury we can't afford when it comes to our child's welfare. Richard moved closer, and Victoria became acutely aware of the hidden camera recording every word. I've made an appointment with a specialist for next week. Richard, I'm 39, not 90. Dr. Nguyen has been monitoring everything carefully. Nevertheless, we're going to get a second opinion, and a third, if necessary. His tone brooked no argument. I won't have anyone questioning our commitment to this child's well-being. The irony was staggering. The man who'd thrown her ring in a pool while threatening their marriage over the pregnancy was now positioning himself as the concerned father, protecting his child's welfare. After Richard left for his office, Victoria remained in the studio for several more minutes, acutely aware of the camera's presence. She felt like an actress on a stage, forced to perform normalcy while her real life collapsed behind the scenes. But as she looked at her painting of the woman at the cliff's edge, Victoria realized something had changed. The woman in the painting had been frozen at the precipice for months, uncertain which path to take. But Victoria was no longer that woman. She was ready to jump. That evening, Victoria lay in bed listening to Richard's breathing settle into the deep rhythm of sleep. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, and she waited another 30 minutes before carefully sliding out from under the covers. The marble floors were cold against her bare feet as she made her way toward the staircase. Richard had been on edge all day, taking multiple phone calls in his study with the door closed. Something was happening, and Victoria's growing paranoia told her it involved her and the baby. Light spilled from under his study door, and she could hear his voice, low and confident. She moved closer, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would wake him. The baby stirred restlessly, responding to her stress. She'll never get half of anything, Richard was saying. I've been moving assets offshore for months. The Cayman accounts are completely untraceable. Victoria pressed herself against the wall outside the study, straining to hear every word. Her hands trembled as she realized she was listening to the systematic destruction of her financial future. What about the baby? The voice on the other end of the call was tinny through the speakerphone, but Victoria recognized it as David Chen, Richard's business partner. DNA test will prove it's not mine. I've already planted evidence about her supposed affair. Credit card charges at hotels during her art classes, some carefully timed receipts that suggest she was meeting someone. Victoria's knees nearly buckled. Richard had been planning this deception for months, creating false evidence of infidelity while she'd been innocently attending pottery workshops and painting classes. The methodical nature of his betrayal was breathtaking. The timing works, Richard continued. She started acting differently about 4 months into the pregnancy. Distant, secretive. Any jury will believe she was having an affair. What if she fights it? Richard's laugh was cold and calculating. She won't. Victoria's never fought for anything in her life. She'll be so overwhelmed with a newborn and no financial resources that she'll accept whatever settlement I offer, especially after the stress of a contested paternity case. Victoria's phone vibrated in her hand. A text from an unknown number. If you're listening to this, don't react. Don't let him see you. Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. E.M. How had Marco known Victoria looked around the darkened hallway, suddenly aware that Richard's surveillance might extend beyond her art studio? The thought that Marco was somehow monitoring the situation was both terrifying and reassuring. The private investigator I hired will testify that she's been meeting with men during her supposed art classes, Richard was saying. Between that and the financial records I've prepared, no court will award her anything significant. What about the house? Prenup covers that. She gets the Beverly Hills condo and enough money to disappear quietly. Maybe enough for a small apartment somewhere in the valley. Victoria thought about the Beverly Hills condo, a tiny one-bedroom property Richard had purchased as an investment years ago. It was worth maybe $300,000, a fraction of their actual net worth. And if she tries to prove paternity, by the time the DNA results come back, she'll be dealing with a newborn and facing criminal charges for fraud. I've documented every instance of her supposed deception, the hotel receipts, the unexplained absences, the mood changes. Any reasonable person would conclude she's been unfaithful. The baby kicked hard, and Victoria had to bite her lip to keep from gasping aloud. The movement was sharp and painful, as if her daughter was protesting the lies being told about her conception. Richard, are you sure about this? She's been a good wife for 20 years. She's been a convenient wife, but I never signed up to be a father to someone else's child, and I certainly didn't sign up to support a woman who thinks she can humiliate me publicly and get away with it. Victoria realized he was talking about the charity gala, about her reaction to him throwing her ring in the pool. In Richard's mind, her shock and hurt had been a calculated humiliation designed to embarrass him in front of his peers. The prenup was ironclad when we married, Richard continued. My lawyers made sure of that. She signed away any claim to my business assets, the properties I owned before marriage, and any inheritance from my family. What about assets acquired during marriage? That's where the offshore accounts come in. Technically, those don't exist, at least not in any form a California court could access. Victoria's mind raced as she tried to calculate their actual net worth. The Malibu mansion alone was worth $15 million. Richard's tech company had gone public 3 years ago, making him worth at least $50 million on paper. Their investment portfolio, real estate holdings, and business interests probably totaled close to $100 million. And he was planning to leave her with a $300,000 condo and enough cash to disappear quietly. She won't know how to fight it, Richard said with confidence. Victoria's never even balanced a checkbook. She has no idea what our actual net worth is, and no resources to hire lawyers capable of challenging my arrangements. What if she gets smart hires representation? With what money I control every account, every credit card, every asset. She can't even buy groceries without my approval. Richard's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Besides, once the baby arrives, she'll be too exhausted and overwhelmed to mount any kind of legal challenge. The casual cruelty of his planning made Victoria feel physically ill. He'd been calculating her destruction while she'd been planning nursery decorations and choosing baby names. The beauty of this plan, Richard continued, is that everyone will see her as the villain, the unfaithful wife who tried to pass off another man's child as mine. I'll be the wounded husband who's generously providing for a woman who betrayed him. And the real father, there is no real father, but that's beside the point. The narrative is all that matters. By the time this hits court, Victoria will be so discredited that any settlement I offer will seem generous. Victoria's phone buzzed again. Stay calm. Document everything. Don't let him know you heard this. Your daughter's future depends on your ability to act normal until we can protect you both. Marco was right. Victoria had to find the strength to pretend ignorance while building a case against her husband's systematic deception. The baby kicked again, gentler this time, as if offering encouragement. I should go, Richard said. Victoria's been sleeping poorly lately. Pregnancy insomnia. I need to make sure she's not wandering around the house. Victoria's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible as Richard's footsteps approached the study door. The handle turned, and light spilled into the hallway. Victoria held her breath, praying that her pregnant silhouette wouldn't be visible from where Richard stood. After what felt like an eternity, the door closed again. Victoria heard him moving around the study, probably preparing for bed. She had minutes to get back upstairs before he noticed her absence. Moving as quietly as possible, Victoria climbed the marble staircase and slipped back into bed. Richard joined her 20 minutes later, settling into his side of the mattress without acknowledging her presence. As she lay in the darkness listening to her husband's breathing, Victoria thought about the systematic way he'd planned her destruction, the false evidence, the hidden assets, the character assassination. He'd been building a case against her for months, maybe years. But Richard had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed Victoria would remain the passive, dependent wife who'd never questioned his authority. He couldn't imagine her fighting back because he'd spent 22 years convincing her she was incapable of independence. The baby moved restlessly in her womb, and Victoria placed both hands protectively over her belly. Her daughter would not grow up watching her mother accept abuse and manipulation. That cycle would end here, tonight, with Victoria's decision to fight back. Tomorrow, she would begin dismantling everything Richard had built to destroy her. But tonight, she lay in bed planning her own strategy, feeling her grandmother's ring on her finger and remembering what it meant to survive impossible circumstances. Some wars, Victoria realized, were won not by strength, but by refusing to surrender when the enemy expected defeat. The next morning, Victoria drove through downtown Los Angeles traffic toward Marco's law office, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough to leave marks. Dr. Nguyen's prenatal appointment had gone well. The baby was healthy and active, but Victoria's blood pressure was elevated enough to cause concern. Stress is dangerous for both you and the baby, Dr. Nguyen had warned. Whatever's happening at home, you need to find ways to manage it before it affects your pregnancy outcomes. Victoria had wanted to explain about the cameras, the phone calls, the systematic planning of her destruction, but Richard had insisted on accompanying her to the appointment. He'd sat in the corner, making notes on his phone, occasionally asking questions about genetic testing and paternity establishment. Now, sitting in traffic, Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. She was 8 months pregnant, financially dependent on a man planning to destroy her reputation and steal her child, and living under surveillance in what should have been her sanctuary. Marco's office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in Century City. The elevator ride up gave Victoria time to compose herself, to push down the panic and focus on the task ahead. Mrs. Morrison, Janet Williams greeted her warmly. Mr. Rodriguez is waiting for you. Can I get you some water or tea? Water would be wonderful, thank you. Marco's office was smaller than she'd expected, but filled with law books, case files, and framed photographs of families who'd clearly been through difficult divorces and emerged victorious. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows gave the space a golden warmth that felt safer than anywhere Victoria had been in months. How are you holding up? Marco asked as she settled into a comfortable chair across from his desk. I listened to more phone calls last night. He's been planning this for months. Marco, maybe years. Victoria's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she recounted Richard's conversation with David Chen. Marco took careful notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, dollar amounts, and specific threats. His professional demeanor was reassuring, but Victoria could see the anger building in his dark eyes as he realized the scope of Richard's deception. The good news, Marco said when she finished, is that your husband just handed us a roadmap to all his hidden assets. The bad news is that he's been more systematic about this than most abusers. Most abusers, Mrs. Morrison, what Richard is doing isn't just divorce planning. It's financial abuse combined with psychological manipulation and character assassination. It's actually illegal in several ways. Janet knocked and entered with a stack of files. I found those cases you requested. Mr. Rodriguez? The precedents for hidden offshore accounts and false evidence in custody proceedings. Thank you, Janet. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to meet Janet Williams, my paralegal. She specializes in high-asset divorce cases involving concealed wealth. Janet was younger than Victoria had expected, maybe late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a slight Southern accent that somehow made her seem both professional and approachable. Mrs. Ott Morrison, I've been researching your husband's business dealings for the past 48 hours, Janet said. There are some interesting discrepancies in his corporate filings that suggest he's been planning asset concealment for much longer than you realize. What kind of discrepancies? Janet opened a thick file folder. Richard Morrison's company went public 3 years ago. Right, but the financial statements filed with the SEC don't match the tax returns filed with the IRS. Someone's been creating 2 sets of books. Marco leaned forward. Which means? which means he's been underreporting income and assets to the IRS while inflating them for investors. That's securities fraud and tax evasion. Janet's voice carried satisfaction. We're not just talking about divorce court anymore. We're talking about federal crimes. Victoria felt dizzy. You're saying Richard has been committing crimes? Multiple crimes over several years, Marco confirmed. The offshore accounts David Chen mentioned, if they're not properly declared to the Treasury Department, that's another federal violation. Your husband isn't just hiding assets from you. He's hiding them from the government. What does that mean for me? It means, Janet said with a slight smile, that you're married to a man whose actual net worth is probably much higher than even you suspected, and he's been breaking federal laws to conceal it. Marco stood and moved to a whiteboard covered with case law references. Mrs. Morrison, in California, you're entitled to half of all marital assets. That includes Richard's business interests, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and any income generated during your marriage. But the prenups can be invalidated if they were signed under false pretenses or if one party concealed assets during the drafting process. Janet interrupted. Based on what we found, Richard was already hiding money when you signed that agreement. Victoria thought about their wedding day 22 years ago, how Richard's lawyers had presented the prenup as a standard procedure for wealthy individuals. She'd been 24, naive about financial matters, and deeply in love. The idea that Richard might be deceiving her had never crossed her mind. There's something else, Marco said gently. The false evidence Richard mentioned, planting hotel receipts, credit card charges. If he's created fraudulent documents to support a fake adultery case, that's forgery and fraud. But how do we prove it? The same way we prove everything else, methodically and carefully, with expert witnesses and forensic accountants. Marco returned to his desk. Mrs. Morrison, your husband thinks he's smarter than the legal system. That kind of arrogance usually leads to mistakes. Janet pulled out another file. We've already found some of those mistakes. The credit card charges he supposedly planted to prove your affair. They were processed at hotels where you can prove you were somewhere else. Gallery openings, medical appointments, family events with witnesses. How did you find that so quickly? Because your husband made a crucial error, Marco explained. He assumed you don't pay attention to details. But Janet ran a preliminary background check and found that you're actually very well documented. Social media posts, gallery registrations, medical records. Your life is an open book, which makes it easy to disprove false allegations. Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. You really think we can beat him, Mrs. Morrison? Marco said seriously. I think we can destroy him, legally, professionally, and financially. The question is whether you're prepared for that kind of battle. The baby kicked, and Victoria placed her hand over the movement. She thought about her daughter growing up watching her mother accept abuse and manipulation, or growing up knowing her mother had fought back against a man who tried to steal their future. What would happen to Richard if we pursue the criminal charges? Federal prison, most likely. Tax evasion and securities fraud carry serious sentences, especially when combined with the dollar amounts we're talking about. Janet's voice was matter-of-fact. Plus disbarment from many corporate boards, forfeiture of hidden assets, and professional disgrace. And if we just pursue the divorce, you get half of everything, full custody of your daughter, and enough money to live independently for the rest of your life, Marco said. But Richard keeps his freedom and probably continues his pattern of abuse with future partners. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she was facing. Through the office windows, she could see the city sprawling toward the ocean. Millions of people living their lives without knowing that her decision in this moment would determine not just her future, but potentially stop Richard from destroying other women. I want to pursue everything, Victoria said finally. The divorce, the criminal charges, all of it. My daughter deserves to grow up in a world where men like Richard face consequences for their actions. Marco and Janet exchanged glances, and Victoria saw respect in their expressions. Mrs. Morrison, Marco said, that's going to be a long, difficult battle. Richard will use every resource at his disposal to discredit you and protect himself. Then we'd better get started. Victoria's voice was stronger than she'd heard it in years. What do we do first? Janet opened her laptop. First, we document everything. Every conversation, every threat, every attempt at intimidation, we build a timeline of his behavior and financial manipulations. Second, Marco added, we get you protected, restraining orders, emergency spousal support, temporary custody arrangements that keep you and the baby safe. Third, Janet continued, we start unraveling his financial empire, forensic accountants, international asset tracers, experts who specialize in finding hidden wealth. Victoria thought about the cameras in her art studio, about Richard's confident assumption that she would never fight back. The man who'd thrown her grandmother's ring in a pool because he thought he could break her spirit was about to discover exactly how wrong he'd been. When do we start? Victoria asked. Marco smiled, and for the first time since the charity gala, Victoria felt like she had allies in her corner. Mrs. Morrison, we already have. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Victoria chose to interpret it as approval. Her daughter would grow up knowing that some things were worth fighting for, and that women supporting women could overcome even the most systematic abuse. Outside the office windows, the sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Victoria watched the light change and realized that for the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks later, Victoria sat in Dr. Nguyen's waiting room for her weekly prenatal appointment, one hand resting on her swollen belly, while the other scrolled through messages from Marco's legal team. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind of depositions, financial discovery, and carefully documented evidence gathering. Richard had grown increasingly suspicious of her newfound confidence, questioning her about every appointment and demanding to see every receipt. This morning, he'd insisted on driving her to the medical office himself, claiming concern for her safety while really ensuring he could monitor her activities. I'll be right outside, he'd said as they pulled into the parking garage. Take as long as you need, darling. The endearment had sounded like a threat, and Victoria knew he was planning something. His behavior over the past 2 weeks had oscillated between excessive concern and barely contained rage, as if he sensed his control slipping but couldn't identify exactly why. Victoria Morrison. Dr. Nguyen's nurse called from the doorway. As Victoria rose carefully from her chair, she heard Richard's voice from the parking garage outside the waiting room windows. He was on his phone, speaking in the low, confident tone she'd learned to fear. The private investigator confirmed it. We have photos of her meeting with that lawyer. Victoria's blood pressure spiked instantly. The baby responded with sharp kicks that made her gasp and sit back down. Richard had been having her followed. Every trip to Marco's office, every meeting with Janet, every attempt to build her case had been documented and reported back to her husband. Mrs. Morrison. The nurse looked concerned. Are you all right? Just give me a moment, Victoria whispered, straining to hear more of Richard's conversation. What about the pregnancy timeline? The voice on the other end was unclear, but Victoria recognized the rhythm of David Chen's speech. Doesn't matter. By the time this hits court, she'll be so overwhelmed with a newborn. She won't fight the settlement. New mothers are too exhausted to think clearly about complex financial arrangements. Victoria felt nauseated as she realized Richard was counting on postpartum vulnerability to coerce her into accepting his fraudulent terms. He was weaponizing the very experience of childbirth against her. And if she tries to present evidence of your hidden assets, her lawyer is competent but not brilliant. He's a mid-tier divorce attorney who takes pool maintenance jobs on weekends. How sophisticated could his asset tracing really be? Victoria almost laughed despite her horror. Richard's arrogance was preventing him from taking Marco seriously, which meant he wasn't adequately protecting himself against the federal investigation Marco and Janet had initiated. Mrs. Morrison, we really need to get your blood pressure checked, the nurse said gently. Dr. Nguyen is concerned about your stress levels. Victoria nodded and allowed herself to be led into the examination room, but she could still hear Richard's voice through the open windows. His conversation continued as Dr. Nguyen began her examination. The timing is perfect, Richard was saying. She's due in 3 weeks. Right after delivery, when she's hormonal and sleep-deprived, I'll present the settlement offer. She'll sign anything to avoid a custody battle. Dr. Nguyen checked Victoria's blood pressure and frowned. 160/95. That's dangerously high for this stage of pregnancy. Victoria, what's your stress level right now? My husband is in the parking garage planning to use my postpartum condition to coerce me into signing away my rights to our marital assets, Victoria said matter-of-factly. Dr. Nguyen paused in her examination. Excuse me, I can hear him through the window. He's on a phone call with his business partner, discussing how to manipulate me after the baby is born. Dr. Nguyen moved to the window and listened for a moment. Her expression darkened as she caught fragments of Richard's conversation. Is everything all right at home, Victoria? Dr. Nguyen's voice carried the careful concern of someone trained to recognize domestic abuse. No, but I'm working with an attorney to protect myself and the baby. Victoria's voice was steady despite her elevated heart rate. Dr. Nguyen, is it true that new mothers are too exhausted to think clearly about complex decisions? Some women experience temporary cognitive changes related to sleep deprivation and hormonal fluctuations. But that doesn't make them legally incompetent. Anyone suggesting that a new mother can't understand financial documents is either ignorant or manipulative. Through the window, Richard's voice carried clearly. The beauty of this timing is that even if she tries to challenge the settlement later, no court will believe she was competent to make informed decisions so soon after giving birth. Dr. Nguyen's jaw tightened. Victoria, I need to document this conversation for your medical records. What your husband is planning could constitute psychological abuse, which affects pregnancy outcomes. What do you mean chronic stress during pregnancy can lead to premature labor, low birth weight, and postpartum depression? If someone is deliberately creating psychological stress for a pregnant woman, that's a form of abuse that medical professionals are required to report. Victoria felt a surge of hope. You'd be willing to testify about that. I'd be professionally obligated to testify about that. Victoria, your blood pressure indicates severe stress. If this continues, we might need to consider early delivery to protect both you and the baby. Outside, Richard's conversation was winding down. Just make sure everything is ready to file the moment she signs. I want this over quickly, before she has time to think clearly or get advice from anyone who might complicate things. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Marco. Are you somewhere safe? We just received word that Richard has hired a private investigator to document your meetings with our office. She showed the text to Dr. Nguyen, who read it with growing concern. Victoria, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Are you afraid of your husband? Victoria thought about the cameras in her art studio, the systematic asset concealment, the plans to use her postpartum condition against her. Yes, not physically, but financially and emotionally. He's been planning my destruction for months. Then I'm going to do something unusual. I'm going to give you a medical recommendation that you take to your attorney immediately. Dr. Nguyen began writing on her prescription pad. Based on your elevated blood pressure and documented psychological stress, I'm recommending immediate separation from the source of stress to protect your pregnancy. You mean leave Richard? I mean protect yourself and your baby from a situation that's threatening both your physical and mental health. This isn't a legal recommendation. It's a medical one. Victoria felt tears threatening to spill. After months of Richard gaslighting her about her emotional responses, having a medical professional validate her concerns felt like a lifeline. Dr. Nguyen, what if he tries to use my stress levels against me in court to prove I'm unfit to care for the baby? Then he'll have to explain why his behavior created that stress in the first place. Victoria, documenting abuse isn't weakness, it's evidence. Through the window, they could see Richard pacing in the parking garage, still on his phone. Victoria realized that his arrogance was making him careless, conducting these conversations in public spaces where they could be overheard and documented. I need to call Marco, Victoria said. Use my office phone. It's more private than your cell. Dr. Nguyen handed her the handset. And Victoria, don't let Richard drive you home today. I'll have my nurse call you a cab and escort you to it. You don't need to be alone with him when he's actively planning your manipulation. As Victoria dialed Marco's number, she felt her daughter moving restlessly in her womb. The baby seemed to sense the tension, responding to her mother's stress with increased activity. Marco Rodriguez. It's Victoria. Richard hired a private investigator. He's been documenting all my meetings with you. We know. Janet discovered the surveillance yesterday. But Victoria, that's actually good news for us. How is that good news? Because hiring private investigators to spy on your spouse during divorce proceedings can be considered stalking and harassment. It's another charge we can add to our growing list. Victoria looked out the window at Richard, still pacing and talking, completely unaware that his own words were being overheard and would soon be documented as evidence of psychological abuse. Marco, Dr. Nguyen says my stress levels are dangerous for the baby. She's recommending immediate separation. Then that's what we're going to do. Victoria, it's time to get you and your daughter somewhere safe. How quickly can you pack a bag? Victoria thought about her art studio, the cameras, the mansion that had become a prison of surveillance and control. I don't want to go back there. Then you don't have to. We'll arrange for a sheriff's escort to collect your belongings. Victoria, this nightmare is almost over. As Victoria ended the call, Dr. Nguyen returned with paperwork and a determined expression. I've documented everything I observed and overheard today. Dr. Nguyen said, your blood pressure, the stress symptoms, and the conversation that caused them. If anyone questions your decision to leave, they'll have to contend with medical evidence that staying was dangerous for both you and your baby. Through the window, Richard was ending his phone call, probably preparing to return to the waiting room and resume his performance as the concerned husband. Dr. Nguyen, Victoria said quietly, thank you for believing me. Victoria, I've been delivering babies for 15 years. I know the difference between normal pregnancy stress and psychological abuse. What your husband is doing is designed to harm you and your child. That makes it my professional responsibility to protect you both. As they finalized the plan for Victoria's safe departure, she felt her grandmother's ring warm on her finger. Some battles, she realized, were won not by strength alone, but by surrounding yourself with people who understood that protecting women and children was worth fighting for. Richard's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the examination room, but for the first time in months, Victoria wasn't afraid. She was ready to fight back, and she wasn't fighting alone. That weekend, while Richard attended his monthly golf tournament at Riviera Country Club, Victoria executed the plan Marco and Janet had carefully orchestrated. Sheriff's deputies accompanied her to the Malibu mansion, their presence both protective and official as she gathered her belongings under court-ordered supervision. Take your time, Mrs. Morrison, Deputy Sandra Martinez said kindly. We're here to ensure your safety and document anything you want to preserve as evidence. Victoria moved through her former sanctuary with new eyes, seeing the cameras she now knew were there, understanding the systematic way Richard had invaded every private space. In her art studio, she carefully packed her paintings, especially the ones showing women at crossroads and cliff edges. Mrs. Morrison. Janet Williams arrived with 2 boxes and a knowing smile. Marco sent me to help with the technical aspects of your departure. Technical aspects, documenting evidence, preserving documentation, and making sure we don't leave anything behind that Richard could use against you. Janet pulled out a professional camera. Plus, we need to photograph those surveillance devices for the criminal case. As Janet methodically documented the hidden cameras, Victoria packed the last 22 years of her life into boxes and suitcases. It was surprising how little she actually wanted to take. Most of the expensive furniture and decorative objects felt tainted by their association with Richard's money and control. What about your grandmother's jewelry? Deputy Martinez asked. The report mentioned specific family heirlooms. Victoria opened the bedroom safe, using the combination Richard thought she didn't know, and retrieved her grandmother's jade collection. The pieces her grandmother had hidden during the Cultural Revolution, preserved through war and displacement, would continue their journey with Victoria and her daughter. Mrs. Morrison, Janet said quietly, you should see this. Victoria followed Janet to Richard's study, where the deputy had opened filing cabinets under the terms of the court order. Spread across the desk were documents that revealed the true scope of Richard's deception. These are the offshore account statements he thought he'd hidden, Janet explained. Cayman Islands, Swiss banks, shell corporations in Delaware. Mrs. Morrison, your husband has been concealing approximately $75 million in assets. $75 million. Victoria sat down heavily, one hand supporting her lower back. I thought we were wealthy, but not that wealthy. This is just what we found in his home office. Marco's forensic accountants think the actual number might be closer to 100 million. Janet's voice carried satisfaction. Richard Morrison is about to discover that hiding assets from your wife also means hiding them from the IRS, and federal agents take that very personally. Deputy Martinez whistled low. Ma'am, you might want to sit down for this next part. We found something else. She handed Victoria a folder labeled Victoria Character Assessment in Richard's handwriting. Inside were detailed notes about Victoria's daily routines, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns, dating back 3 years. He's been studying me, Victoria whispered, reading entries like, Victoria cried during commercial about abandoned animals, emotional manipulation opportunity, and Victoria uncomfortable with confrontation, will avoid legal battle to preserve peace. Mrs. Morrison, Janet said gently, this level of systematic documentation of a spouse's behavior is consistent with psychological abuse profiles. Richard hasn't just been planning a divorce, he's been conducting a psychological experiment designed to make you believe you're incapable of independence. Victoria thought about the past 3 years, how Richard's subtle criticisms and helpful suggestions had gradually eroded her confidence. Every time she'd expressed interest in returning to work, he'd reminded her that she'd been out of the art world too long. Every time she'd wanted to manage household finances, he'd insisted she was too creative for such mundane tasks. The good news, Deputy Martinez said, is that documenting this behavior is also documenting crimes, stalking, harassment, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Your husband created evidence of his own criminal activity. What happens next? Next, Janet said with a smile, we turn Richard's own evidence against him. The private investigator he hired, the man, has been documenting Richard's meetings with questionable financial advisors and offshore banking specialists. Turns out surveillance works both ways. As they finished packing, Victoria's phone rang. Marco's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with growing confidence. How's the evidence gathering going? Marco asked. Better than we hoped. Janet found documentation of hidden assets worth at least $75 million. Victoria, I need to tell you something important. While you've been packing, our forensic accountants made a discovery that changes everything. What kind of discovery? Richard's tech company went public based on artificially inflated valuations. He's been using hidden accounts to manipulate stock prices and deceive investors. This isn't just tax evasion anymore. This is securities fraud at a federal level. Victoria sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Richard's criminal behavior. How long has this been going on? Based on the documentation we found, at least 5 years, maybe longer. Marco's voice was serious but optimistic. Victoria, your husband isn't just facing divorce court anymore. He's facing federal criminal charges that could result in 20 years in prison. And what does that mean for me and the baby? It means you're about to become a very wealthy single mother with full custody of your daughter and no interference from Richard Morrison ever again. Through the mansion's windows, Victoria could see the Pacific Ocean stretching toward the horizon. The same view she'd admired for 22 years, but now it looked different. It looked like freedom. Marco, Victoria said slowly, when Richard comes home from golf today and finds me gone, what will happen? He'll probably call you first, trying to manipulate you into coming back. Then he'll call his lawyers, who will tell him he's in serious legal trouble. Then he'll realize that the wife he thought was too weak to fight back has just destroyed his entire criminal enterprise. Janet approached with a final box of documents. Mrs. Morrison, we found Richard's emergency plans, alternate passports, cash reserves, contact information for countries without extradition treaties. Your husband was preparing to flee the country if his schemes were discovered. Flight risk, Deputy Martinez noted with professional interest. That'll look great when the federal prosecutor requests remand without bail. As they loaded the last of Victoria's belongings into the sheriff's van, she took one final look at the mansion that had been both her prison and her palace. The baby kicked, and Victoria placed her hand over the movement. What do you think, sweetheart? She asked aloud. Ready to start our new life? The baby's response was a series of gentle movements that felt like approval. Victoria smiled and climbed into the passenger seat of Deputy Martinez's cruiser. Where to, Mrs. Morrison? The deputy asked. Santa Monica. I have a new apartment with an ocean view and no surveillance cameras. As they drove down the Pacific Coast Highway, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Where are you? Your car is gone and the house seems empty. Call me immediately. Victoria showed the message to Deputy Martinez, who chuckled. Mrs. Morrison, I think your husband is about to have the worst day of his life. Good, Victoria said simply, and meant it. The afternoon sun painted the ocean in shades of gold and turquoise, and for the first time in years, Victoria felt like she was driving towards something better instead of running away from something terrible. Her daughter would be born free, and that made everything worth fighting for. Monday morning brought the storm Victoria had been preparing for, but it arrived faster and more publicly than anyone had anticipated. She was leaving her routine prenatal appointment with Dr. Nguyen when Richard appeared in the medical building's parking garage, his face flushed with rage and his usually perfect appearance disheveled. Victoria, his voice echoed off the concrete walls. Get in the car. We need to talk. I have my own transportation. Richard, Victoria continued walking toward the taxi. Dr. Nguyen's office had called for her, one hand supporting her lower back, the other gripping her purse containing Marco's business card and the restraining order papers. Don't walk away from me. Richard's voice rose to a shout that made other patients and visitors turn to stare. You think you can humiliate me, make me look like a fool in front of my business partners. Victoria realized that Richard had discovered the federal investigation into his financial activities. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and he was panicking in the most public way possible. Sir, you need to lower your voice, said Dr. Peterson, an elderly physician who was helping his wife into their car. This is a medical facility, not a sports arena. Mind your own business, old man, Richard snarled, his usual polished demeanor completely abandoned. This is between me and my wife. Victoria felt the baby responding to her elevated stress levels with sharp, painful kicks. The contractions she'd been experiencing sporadically for the past week suddenly intensified, making her gasp and lean against a parked car for support. Victoria, get in the car now, Richard demanded, moving closer. We're going home, and you're going to call off your lawyers and stop this ridiculous charade. I'm not going anywhere with you, Victoria managed between contractions. And this isn't a charade, Richard. This is me protecting our daughter from a father who'd rather destroy her mother than lose control. Our daughter? Richard's laugh was harsh and bitter. You mean the bastard child you're trying to pass off as mine? I know about your affair, Victoria. I have evidence of every hotel you visited, every lie you told. The accusations hung in the air like poison, and Victoria realized that several people were now recording the confrontation on their phones. Richard's public meltdown was being documented by witnesses, creating exactly the kind of evidence Marco had told her would be crucial in court. The only lies here are the ones you created, Victoria said clearly, her voice carrying across the parking garage. Fake hotel receipts, forged credit card statements, manufactured evidence of affairs that never happened. You've been planning this destruction for months. Richard, but you made one crucial mistake. What mistake? Richard stepped closer, his voice menacing. You assumed I'd never fight back. Victoria's contractions were getting stronger, but her voice remained steady. You assumed the woman who let you control her for 22 years would never find the courage to expose your crimes? Crimes! Richard's face went pale. I haven't committed any crimes. Securities fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and now stalking and harassment. Victoria ticked off the charges on her fingers. Oh, and attempting to coerce a pregnant woman into signing fraudulent legal documents. That's a federal crime too. Richard, security guard James Wilson had been watching the confrontation from the medical building entrance and finally decided to intervene. Sir, I need you to step back from the pregnant lady and lower your voice. You're disturbing patients and creating a public disturbance. I'm talking to my wife, Richard shouted. This is a private family matter. Nothing about this conversation is private anymore, Victoria said, noting the growing crowd of witnesses. Just like nothing about our marriage was private when you installed surveillance cameras in my art studio to monitor my conversations and activities. The revelation sent a murmur through the gathering crowd. Dr. Nguyen appeared from the medical building, took one look at the scene, and immediately approached Victoria. Victoria, are you having contractions? Dr. Nguyen's voice cut through Richard's bluster. Yes, and they're getting stronger. Victoria winced as another wave of pain hit her. I think the stress might be triggering early labor. That's it, Dr. Nguyen said firmly. Mr. Morrison, your behavior is putting your wife and baby in medical danger. Security, please escort this man off the property immediately. You can't make me leave, Richard's voice cracked with desperation. She's my wife. That's my baby. Sir, security guard, Wilson said calmly, you have two choices. You can leave voluntarily, or I can call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Your choice. Victoria felt another contraction, stronger than the others, and her water broke in a gush that soaked her maternity dress and the concrete beneath her feet. Oh my God, she whispered, looking down at the fluid. Dr. Nguyen, I think the baby's coming. The doctor immediately took charge. James, call 911 immediately. Victoria, we need to get you inside and lying down. The stress has triggered premature labor. Premature? Richard's anger shifted to confusion. But she's not due for 3 weeks. Extreme psychological stress can trigger early labor, Dr. Nguyen said coldly. Mr. Morrison, your behavior has literally endangered your wife and child. If anything happens to this baby, you bear responsibility. Victoria found herself surrounded by helpful strangers as Dr. Nguyen and a nurse who'd appeared from the medical building helped her toward the entrance. The contractions were coming faster now, and the baby's urgent movements suggested she was ready to make her entrance into the world. Wait, Richard called after them. I want to be there for the birth. Mr. Morrison? Dr. Nguyen turned back with professional authority. You are no longer welcome in my medical facility. Your presence causes dangerous stress responses in my patient. Security will ensure you remain in the parking garage. As they helped Victoria into a wheelchair, she heard Richard on his phone, probably calling his lawyers to complain about being excluded from his daughter's birth. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who'd spent months planning to deny paternity was now demanding parental rights. Dr. Nguyen, Victoria said between contractions, I need to call Marco Rodriguez. He needs to know the baby is coming early. I'll call him myself, Dr. Nguyen replied. Right now, your job is to focus on bringing your daughter safely into the world. As they rushed toward the medical building's entrance, Victoria could hear Richard arguing with security guards, demanding access and threatening lawsuits. His voice grew fainter as the automatic doors closed behind them, but his words followed her. She can't keep me from my own child. I have rights. Actually, Dr. Nguyen said quietly as they waited for the elevator. Based on the restraining order your attorney filed this morning, he has very limited rights, and after today's public display, he'll be lucky if he gets supervised visitation. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward Marco for anticipating Richard's escalation and filing protective orders before the confrontation could get worse. Her daughter would be born into safety, protected by legal documents and medical professionals who understood the difference between concerned parenting and abusive control. The elevator doors opened, and as they rose toward the delivery floor, Victoria felt her grandmother's ring warm on her finger. Some battles, she realized, were won not through confrontation but through preparation, documentation, and the support of people who understood that protecting women and children was worth any amount of public drama. Her daughter was about to be born free, and Richard's public meltdown had just provided all the evidence any court would need to ensure she stayed that way. 3 days later, with baby Emma Rose safely cradled in her arms, Victoria sat in Judge Maria Santos's courtroom, listening to Richard's lawyer attempt to explain away months of systematic fraud and abuse. The emergency custody hearing had been expedited due to the circumstances of Emma's birth and Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. Your Honor, Richard's attorney, Thomas Bradley, argued desperately, my client's alleged financial irregularities have no bearing on his fitness as a father. He simply wants access to his newborn daughter. Judge Santos, a stern woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the stack of evidence Marco's team had compiled. The documentation was overwhelming: hidden offshore accounts, forged documents, surveillance recordings, and witness testimony from the medical center parking garage confrontation. Mr. Bradley, Judge Santos said dryly, your client's alleged financial irregularities include $75 million in concealed assets, fraudulent tax returns, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. These aren't irregularities. These are federal crimes. Marco stood at the plaintiff's table, his presence calm and authoritative. Beside him, Janet Williams had organized evidence files with military precision. Victoria felt grateful for their professional competence, especially since she was still physically recovering from Emma's dramatic entrance into the world. Furthermore, Judge Santos continued, the evidence shows systematic psychological abuse designed to manipulate Mrs. Morrison into accepting fraudulent settlement terms. Dr. Guyen's medical testimony confirms that Mr. Morrison's behavior directly caused the premature labor that endangered both mother and child. Richard sat beside his lawyer, his usually perfect appearance haggard from 3 days of legal disasters. Federal agents had frozen his accounts, seized his business records, and issued warrants for documents from his offshore banking contacts. The man who'd thrown Victoria's ring in a pool to demonstrate his power was discovering what real powerlessness felt like. Your Honor, Marco addressed the court with measured authority. Mrs. Morrison is requesting full legal and physical custody of Emma Rose Morrison, with Mr. Morrison's visitation rights limited to supervised contact pending resolution of the federal criminal charges against him. Mr. Bradley, does your client contest Mrs. Morrison's fitness as a mother? Judge Santos asked. No, Your Honor, but we do question the motivation behind these sudden allegations of financial impropriety and abuse. Mrs. Morrison never complained about her marriage until she began consulting with divorce attorneys. Victoria felt Emma stir in her arms, and she looked down at her daughter's perfect features. Emma had arrived 2 weeks early, but completely healthy, with thick dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with calm intelligence. Mr. Bradley, Judge Santos's voice carried warning, your client hired private investigators to spy on his pregnant wife, installed surveillance cameras in her private spaces, and created false evidence of adultery to use against her in divorce proceedings. These actions are documented and corroborated by multiple witnesses. Furthermore, Marco added, Mr. Morrison's own recorded conversations reveal his plan to use Mrs. Morrison's postpartum condition to coerce her into accepting fraudulent settlement terms. He specifically stated that new mothers are too exhausted to think clearly about complex financial arrangements. Janet stood and handed a transcript to the court clerk. Your Honor, this is a certified transcript of Mr. Morrison's conversation with his business partner David Chen, recorded on the evening of October 15th. Mr. Morrison explicitly discusses using his wife's physical and emotional vulnerability after childbirth to manipulate her into signing away her legal rights. Judge Santos read the transcript, her expression growing colder with each line. Mr. Morrison, did you actually say that new mothers are too overwhelmed to understand financial documents? Richard stood slowly, his face flushed with embarrassment. Your Honor, I was simply concerned about the stress of complex legal proceedings affecting Victoria's recovery. Mr. Morrison, you described your wife's postpartum condition as an opportunity for manipulation. That's not concern. That's predatory behavior toward a vulnerable new mother. Victoria watched Richard's composure crumble as he realized his own words were being used to demonstrate his unfitness as a father. The man who'd been so confident in his ability to control the narrative was discovering that truth had a way of emerging despite careful planning. Your Honor, Marco continued, Mrs. Morrison is also requesting immediate spousal support in the amount of $50,000 per month, access to marital accounts for living expenses, and exclusive use of the Beverly Hills property during divorce proceedings. $50,000 a month, Richard's lawyer objected. That's excessive for anyone's living expenses. Mr. Bradley, Judge Santos replied, your client has been concealing income and assets worth approximately $100 million. $50,000 per month represents less than 1% of the marital estate's actual value. If anything, Mrs. Morrison's request is modest. Janet approached the witness stand with a folder of financial documents. Your Honor, our forensic accounting team has identified hidden assets including real estate holdings in 3 states, investment accounts in offshore jurisdictions, and business interests that were never disclosed during the marriage. Mr. Morrison, Judge Santos addressed Richard directly, you understand that concealing assets from your spouse is also concealing them from the IRS, correct? Your Honor, I've always filed accurate tax returns. Richard protested weakly. Then you'll have no difficulty explaining why your reported income to the Treasury Department is 60% lower than your actual earnings, as documented by your business's internal accounting records. The courtroom fell silent except for Emma's soft breathing and the occasional shuffle of papers. Victoria realized she was witnessing the complete destruction of Richard's carefully constructed lies, all accomplished with his own documentation and recorded words. Mr. Morrison, Judge Santos continued, the evidence suggests you've been planning to defraud your wife and the federal government simultaneously. That level of calculation and deception raises serious questions about your judgment and character. Your Honor, Richard's lawyer made one final attempt. My client has no history of violence or substance abuse. Surely financial disputes don't warrant complete separation from his child? Mr. Bradley, your client systematically planned the psychological and financial destruction of his pregnant wife. He created false evidence, hired surveillance, and explicitly planned to exploit her postpartum vulnerability. That's not a financial dispute. That's psychological warfare against a new mother. Victoria felt tears threatening as she realized that Judge Santos understood the full scope of what Richard had planned to do to her and Emma. This court finds, Judge Santos announced, that Mr. Morrison poses a substantial risk to the emotional and financial well-being of both mother and child. Mrs. Morrison is awarded temporary full custody of Emma Rose Morrison, with Mr. Morrison's parental rights limited to 2 hours of supervised visitation per week, pending resolution of federal criminal proceedings. Richard shot to his feet. Your Honor, you can't keep me from my daughter. I have constitutional rights as a father. Mr. Morrison, you forfeited those rights when you chose to treat your wife and unborn child as obstacles to your financial schemes, rather than as family members deserving protection and respect. Judge Santos's voice was final. Sit down. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Morrison is awarded exclusive use of the Beverly Hills property, access to all marital accounts for living expenses, and temporary spousal support of $50,000 per month. Mr. Morrison's assets remain frozen pending federal investigation, but sufficient funds will be released to ensure Mrs. Morrison and the baby's immediate needs are met. Marco leaned over to whisper to Victoria, We won everything we asked for, and more. Victoria looked down at Emma, who had slept peacefully through the entire proceeding, despite the life-changing decisions being made around her. She'll never have to wonder if her mother was strong enough to protect her, Victoria whispered back. Mr. Morrison, Judge Santos addressed Richard one final time. You are hereby ordered to surrender your passport to this court and to have no contact with Mrs. Morrison except through counsel. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and revocation of all visitation rights. As the gavel fell, Victoria felt 22 years of fear and control finally release their hold on her life. Emma stirred and opened her dark eyes, looking directly at her mother as if to say, We did it. Richard's business partner, David Chen, who had been subpoenaed to testify, approached Victoria as they left the courtroom. Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that Richard's business partners had no knowledge of his personal financial arrangements. We're cooperating fully with federal investigators. Thank you. Mr. Chen, I hope this doesn't destroy your company. The company will survive. We're removing Richard from all leadership positions and implementing new oversight procedures. What he did to you was unconscionable. As they walked through the courthouse lobby, Victoria saw Richard arguing heatedly with his lawyer near the elevators. His face was red with rage and humiliation, but for the first time in their 22-year marriage, his anger couldn't touch her. Mrs. Morrison, Marco said as they reached the courthouse steps, you should know that the federal prosecutor wants to meet with you next week. Your testimony will be crucial in the criminal case against Richard. What kind of sentence is he looking at? With the evidence we've compiled, probably 15 to 20 years in federal prison, plus forfeiture of all assets obtained through fraudulent means? Marco's voice carried satisfaction. Richard Morrison will spend the next 2 decades learning what it feels like to have no control over his circumstances. Janet joined them on the courthouse steps, her arms full of legal documents and evidence files. Mrs. Morrison, the forensic accountants finished their preliminary assessment. Your share of the legitimate marital assets comes to approximately $48 million. Victoria almost laughed. Richard tried to leave me with a $300,000 condo in grocery money. Instead, you're about to become one of the wealthiest single mothers in California, Janet said with a grin. Financial independence doesn't begin to cover it. As they walked toward Marco's car, Victoria thought about the journey from the charity gala pool deck to the courthouse steps. 3 months ago, she'd been a controlled, monitored wife with no knowledge of her own financial situation. Today, she was a free woman with more money than she could spend in several lifetimes and a daughter who would grow up knowing her mother had fought for their future. "Marco," Victoria said as they reached the parking garage, "I have a question that's not about legal proceedings." "What's that? Are you still working weekends as a diving instructor?" Marco smiled, and Victoria realized it was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely relaxed since their first meeting by the pool. "Actually, I was thinking about taking some time off from the weekend job." "Why do you ask?" "Because Emma and I are going to need swimming lessons eventually, and I'd prefer to learn from someone I trust." As they drove through downtown Los Angeles toward Victoria's new life, Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, unaware that she'd just inherited a world where women supporting women could overcome even the most systematic narcissistic abuse. The afternoon sun painted the city in shades of gold, and Victoria realized that for the first time in 22 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow without fear of what Richard might do to control or destroy it. Some victories, she understood now, were worth every moment of the battle that earned them. 6 months later, on a sunny Saturday morning, Victoria stood on the deck of her new beachfront home in Santa Monica, watching Emma gurgle happily in her bouncy seat while the Pacific Ocean sparkled in the morning light. The modest three-bedroom house was a far cry from the Malibu mansion, but every room belonged entirely to her and Emma, free from surveillance cameras and the oppressive weight of Richard's control. "Good morning, sweetheart," Victoria cooed to Emma, who responded with a toothless grin and enthusiastic arm waving. At 6 months old, Emma was a happy, healthy baby who seemed to thrive in their peaceful environment. The sound of footsteps on the wooden deck announced Marco's arrival for their weekly coffee date, a tradition that had evolved from legal consultations into something more personal and meaningful. "How are my two favorite clients this morning?" Marco asked, settling into the chair beside Emma's bouncy seat. He'd taken to bringing toys for Emma and fresh pastries from the Santa Monica Farmers Market for Victoria. "We're perfect," Victoria replied, pouring coffee from the French press. "Emma slept through the night for the third time this week, and I finished 2 new paintings yesterday." "Business is good," Victoria smiled as she thought about her new art studio, a converted garage space where she taught painting classes to other women rebuilding their lives after difficult divorces. "More than good. I have a waiting list of students, and the gallery in Venice wants to showcase my Liberation series next month." The Liberation series consisted of 12 paintings depicting women at various stages of breaking free from controlling relationships. The centerpiece was a portrait of a woman diving into deep water to retrieve something precious, painted in shades of blue and gold that seemed to glow with inner light. "Any word from Richard's legal team?" Victoria asked, though she asked more from curiosity than concern. "His sentencing is scheduled for next month. The federal prosecutor is recommending 18 years, with forfeiture of all assets obtained through fraudulent means." Marco's voice was matter-of-fact. "Richard Morrison's reign of financial terror is officially over." Victoria felt no satisfaction in Richard's downfall, only relief that he could never again use money and manipulation to control vulnerable women. The divorce settlement had been finalized 3 months ago, awarding Victoria $62 million in assets and full custody of Emma, with no visitation rights for Richard pending completion of his prison sentence. "Dr. Nguyen called yesterday," Victoria said, watching Emma play with a colorful rattle. "She wanted to thank me again for speaking at her conference about recognizing domestic abuse in medical settings." "How did that feel?" "Empowering. When I told those doctors and nurses about the cameras, the financial manipulation, the systematic planning to use my postpartum condition against me, you could see the recognition in their eyes. They'd all seen patients with similar situations, but hadn't known how to help." Marco reached over and gently tickled Emma's feet, making her laugh with pure delight. "What about the foundation? Have you made any decisions about that?" Victoria had been considering establishing a foundation to help women in high-asset divorces who lacked resources to fight systematic financial abuse. "I think I want to call it the Jade Foundation. After my grandmother's ring, we'd provide legal funding, expert witnesses, and emotional support for women facing what I went through." "That's beautiful, Victoria. Your grandmother would be proud." Victoria looked down at the jade ring on her finger. still warm and comforting after all these months. You know what she'd be most proud of? That Emma will grow up knowing her mother was strong enough to fight for both their futures? Emma babbled something that sounded almost like words, and both adults turned their attention to her with delight. The baby was reaching for Victoria's ring, fascinated by the way it caught the morning sunlight. "Marco," Victoria said quietly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why do you really work weekends as a diving instructor? I know you said it was for stress relief, but there's more to it, isn't there?" Marco was quiet for a moment, watching the waves roll onto the beach below them. "My mother was in a marriage like yours, not as wealthy, but the same patterns of control and manipulation. She never had the resources or support to fight back. When she died, she was still trapped in that relationship, still believing she deserved the treatment she received. I'm sorry. When I became a lawyer, I promised myself I'd help women like her whenever I could. The diving instruction keeps me grounded, reminds me that there's beauty and peace in the world beyond legal battles and courtroom victories." Victoria reached over and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for saving us." "Victoria, you saved yourself. I just provided the tools." As if responding to the conversation, Emma dropped her rattle and looked directly at Marco with the serious expression she sometimes wore when processing new information. Then she smiled and reached for him, and Victoria watched with warmth as Marco carefully picked up her daughter. "Emma Rose Morrison," Marco said solemnly, "you are going to grow up knowing that you are loved, protected, and surrounded by people who believe in your worth and potential. And she'll grow up knowing that women supporting women can overcome anything," Victoria added. Later that afternoon, Victoria carried Emma down to the beach for their daily walk along the water's edge. The baby loved watching the waves and listening to the sound of seagulls, responding to the ocean's rhythm with contentment that seemed to mirror her mother's peace. As they walked, Victoria reflected on the question someone had asked at Dr. Nguyen's conference. How do you know when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving? The answer, Victoria had realized, was different for every woman. But there were universal signs. When someone systematically undermines your confidence, monitors your activities, controls your finances, or plans to use your vulnerabilities against you, staying becomes a threat to your survival and your children's future. The hardest part, Victoria had told the medical professionals, isn't recognizing abuse. It's believing you deserve better and finding the courage to fight for it. But you don't see your own strength until you have someone else to protect. Emma gurgled and pointed at a pelican flying overhead, and Victoria found herself thinking about how different her daughter's childhood would be from her own. Emma would grow up with financial security, emotional support, and the example of a mother who had refused to accept manipulation and control as the price of marriage. Someone asked me recently, Victoria said aloud to Emma, how I knew when to leave. The truth is, I didn't know I was strong enough until I had you to protect. Sometimes we find our courage not for ourselves, but for the people who need us to be brave. Emma babbled what sounded like agreement, and Victoria laughed with pure joy. The sound echoed across the beach, mixing with the ocean waves and seagull calls to create a symphony of freedom and new beginnings. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Victoria thought about all the women still trapped in relationships like her marriage to Richard. The Jade Foundation would help some of them, but the real change would come from women sharing their stories, supporting each other, and refusing to accept abuse as the price of financial security. This is what happy sounds like, Victoria whispered to Emma as they turned back toward their beachfront home. The baby responded with a contented sigh, and Victoria smiled as she realized that for the first time in 22 years, she was exactly where she belonged, free, financially independent, and surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Her grandmother's ring caught the last rays of sunlight, sending small rainbows dancing across the sand, and Victoria knew that some treasures were indeed worth fighting for. The ring had survived war, displacement, and abuse to arrive at this moment of peace and possibility. As they climbed the steps to their deck, Victoria could see Marco through the kitchen window, washing coffee cups and tidying up after their morning together. Emma waved enthusiastically when she spotted him, and Victoria felt her heart expand with gratitude for the unexpected gift of finding love, built on respect rather than control. The ocean waves continued their eternal rhythm below, And Victoria understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other women find their strength, and new moments of joy with her daughter. But tonight, as she settled Emma into her crib and listened to the peaceful sounds of their home by the sea, Victoria Chen Morrison was simply a woman who had fought for her freedom and won, surrounded by love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to grow stronger together. The baby's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, and Victoria smiled as she realized that this was exactly what victory looked like: quiet, peaceful, and full of infinite possibility.